What is a Christian? Is the answer to that question just a matter of opinion? The world would like us to think that it is. The answer to that question, and many others, is just what you believe, just what you decided on in your own mind. Today, no one is right except for the person who says no one is right. And he's always right. Every point of view is tolerated today, except for the view that says there is right and there is wrong. There's truth and there's falsehood. But in Galatians, we'll discover that God says that following Jesus Christ is not just a matter of opinion. It's not just about what you believe, what you've made up in your mind. That when it comes to following Jesus Christ, there is right and there's wrong. There's truth and there's falsehood about Christianity. And so by the end of our study in the book of Galatians, we'll be able to answer with a final authority, an authority outside of ourselves, an authority that comes by revelation from God himself. What is a Christian? Now for tonight's study, Galatians chapter 1, verses 1 to 10, let me make a few comments. Number one, we need to understand the problem of confusion that had gripped the church in Galatia. Galatia is, roughly speaking today, in modern Turkey. Paul had gone there and had preached, proclaimed the gospel in various cities around Galatia, which is a region. Here he is writing to those churches that had established out of the preaching of the gospel, church plants, like us, because something has happened in those churches. Troublers had come, false teachers had arrived. Chapter 1 verse 7 tells us, evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. Who were these false teachers? Why were they troubling the churches in Galatia? They were people who were confusing what it means to be a Christian. As we'll see later on in Galatians, they were attacking Paul and the gospel by insisting obedience to the Jewish law, primarily through circumcision. For the Jew, in the Old Testament, from Genesis chapter 17 onwards, circumcision was the sign of being under contract. It was an outward sign of being part of the covenant family of God. Circumcision was the symbol of accepting the Old Testament as the system that ruled your life. This is stated in Galatians chapter 5, verse 3. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is required to obey the whole law. But these Galatians were Gentiles. They weren't Jews by birth, and they were uncircumcised. They had never taken the law upon themselves. So can these non-Jews become Christians without becoming Jews first? That's the question that these troublers had come in asking and were using to confuse the Christians at Galatia. At first glance, we might think to ourselves, this question has nothing to do with us. But in these studies, we'll find that the same type of mistake is actually being made today that these troublers were making in the first century. I want you, secondly, to notice Paul's unusual greeting. Every culture has its standard form of greeting that we use when we write letters. For example, we might use a form of greeting like this. Dear Aunt Agatha, thank you for the Christmas present. An elephant's foot umbrella stand. It's just what I've always needed. Yours sincerely, Frank. The first century had a standard form of greeting of its own when you wrote a letter. The writer's name, Frank, the people to whom he was writing, Dear Aunt Agatha, and greetings. How are you? How are things going? You can see this standard form throughout the New Testament. However, the Christian form was slightly different. It always included the greetings, grace and peace from our Lord Jesus Christ, or some variant of that. Paul also had a standard form of greeting, and it generally went like this. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the church in Galatia, grace and peace to you. I always thank God for you because of, and I'm praying for you. Notice, though, that in Galatians, the greeting is slightly different. There's a variant on it. Now, you need to ask yourselves the question tonight, why? Why would Paul change this greeting compared to the other greetings? And this is important. Is he trying to draw our attention to something? Number 3, what is the gospel? The key word here is grace, the giving. and it means generosity. It's the opposite to something we have earned, something we do for ourselves. Let me give you an illustration. If at the end of a week's work, your boss gives you a week's pay, that is not generosity. It is just what you have earned, what you deserve or merit because of what you have done. But if you don't turn up for work and the boss still hands you a packet of money, that is grace. That is surprising, astonishing generosity, and entirely unearned. Grace and merit are complete opposites. You cannot get something from nothing. You cannot get something by grace and by merit at the same time. It's either one or the other. You either earn something or you're given it. And grace, astonishing generosity, is what we get from Jesus Christ, Paul tells us. And he drives that point home. Chapter 1, verse 4. He gave himself for us to rescue us from the present evil age according to the will of God. The Galatians are turning away from God who has called them through this astonishing generosity, through this self-giving of Jesus Christ. What's more, Paul is completely astonished that you're deserting the one who called you by his grace, and that you're doing it so quickly. Verses 7, 8, and 9 tell us of the amazing character of the gospel that makes this idea that all religion is just a matter of opinion absolute nonsense. In these verses, the point is that there's only one gospel of grace in Jesus Christ. But these gospel twisters, these people would try to pervert the gospel of grace into something entirely different. And Paul makes another point. The authority of the gospel is bound up in the gospel message itself, not in the messenger and not in the preacher. So that if an angel or another apostle or anybody else comes preaching another gospel, Paul basically says they can go to hell. Well, how do we bring this all to a close? Notice fourthly that Paul draws a line in the sand. There's only one gospel, he says, the gospel of grace, the self-giving of Jesus Christ. There's no other gospel. It's either this or nothing. That's intolerant, of course, comes the protests. Yes, God is intolerant when it comes to untruth. Is it tolerant to say that the earth is both flat and round? There are some issues where tolerance just amounts to foolishness, and the truth of the gospel is one of them. If Jesus is God, then Krishna isn't. If Allah is God, then Jesus isn't. You see how the logic begins to work? Both can't be true. Both claims cannot be right. That's the point that Paul's driving home. It's exactly the same as saying, yeah, the earth is flat. And that's fine. You can believe that the earth is round if you want to. Both opinions are right and neither really matter. At the end of the day, there's truth and falsehood. At the end of the day, there has to be right or wrong. In Galatians, God is telling us that there's no other gospel, that there's no other way back home. There's no other way to be rescued, reconciled, restored, or brought back into relationship with God. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of grace, unearned, unmerited, God's favor, or nothing.